And the winner is Peter Falk, Columbo.
In 1973, a script landed on NBC's desk that would have shown America's favorite detective facing a killer with no motive, just pure evil. Network bosses panicked and locked it away. They said it was too dark for television. They claimed audiences weren't ready. But the real reason this Columbo episode stayed buried for 50 years was much more sinister. Today, we're exposing what they tried to hide. When Hollywood came to a grinding halt in early 1960 due to a writer's strike, two struggling screenwriters, Richard Levinson and William Link, found themselves scrambling to make ends meet. But instead of waiting it out, they found a sneaky little loophole. They realized that live TV wasn't included in the strike restrictions. So they went for it. They wrote a murder mystery called Enough Rope for NBC's new live color show, The Chevy Mystery Show. It was rushed, desperate, and they even tricked their own agent to get it sold. But in that messy little script, something incredible was born. A rumpled, odd detective named Lieutenant Columbo. They had no idea that this last-ditch effort would turn into a pop culture legend. The character wasn't even entirely original. They'd been reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and the detective in that book, Porfiry Petrovich, gave them the idea. A soft-spoken guy who looked harmless but was actually brilliant. That's what they wanted Columbo to be. Instead of revealing the killer at the end like most stories, they decided to show the killer right at the beginning. That way, the tension came from watching how Columbo, with all his quirks and questions, would slowly trap them. It was clever, fresh, and psychological, and people loved it. The first ever Columbo wasn't even Peter Falk. On July 31st, 1960, the character was played by Bert Freed in a live broadcast. He did a good job, quiet, watchful, but the real magic was still years away. 2 years later, the story was turned into a play called Prescription Murder, and Thomas Mitchell played Columbo on stage. Audiences liked it, even if it never made it to Broadway. Sadly, that would be Mitchell's final role before his death. But things really changed in 1968. NBC decided to make Prescription Murder into a TV movie, and this time they cast Peter Falk. He wasn't the first choice. Lee J. Cobb and Bing Crosby both said no, but he fit the role perfectly. Falk gave Columbo something new, a strange charm mixed with razor-sharp focus. In that first movie, he was actually kind of clean-cut. His hair was neat, his suit was pressed. The famous raincoat made its debut, though, and it stuck around forever. That raincoat? Falk bought it himself during a rainstorm in New York for just $15. He wore it in the movie, then kept wearing it. Turns out, it wasn't just some random coat. It was actually made by a high-end Spanish company. But to Falk, it was just the right look. He even started bringing his own clothes to set. The shoes, the suits, even the car. He picked that scruffy old Peugeot himself. It all helped create a detective who felt real, not dressed up by a wardrobe team. What made Columbo even more fascinating was the way Falk played him. He wasn't just acting, he was playing mind games. Falk would improvise lines, get distracted mid-scene, and throw off the actors who were supposed to be guilty. It worked. They looked irritated, nervous, just like their characters should. He might pull out a shopping list instead of evidence, or ask to borrow a pencil for no reason. These were tricks, not accidents. The actors weren't in on it, but the audience was, and that made Columbo even more fun to watch. And of course, there's the line. Just one more thing. That catchphrase? It wasn't part of some genius plan. Levinson and Link admitted they only added it because a scene was too short and they didn't want to retype it. So they had Columbo walk back into the room and say it. And that's how TV's most famous detective move was born. What started as a lazy fix became a signature moment that usually signaled the killer's doom. The Columbo character was so unique that even his name stayed a mystery. In all those years, viewers never really knew his first name. Sometimes you could catch Frank Columbo on a blurry badge, but the creators insisted they never gave him a first name. They wanted it to stay that way. when a trivia writer named Fred Worth made up Philip Columbo as a fake fact to catch copycats, and Trivial Pursuit fell for it, he actually sued them. He lost, but the myth stuck around. Even at Columbo's nephew's wedding, everyone just called him Lieutenant. Imagine going through life and your family doesn't even call you by your first name. Behind the scenes, the casting process was just as intense. Each episode had guest stars who played the killers, and the team often considered dozens of actors for those parts. For one role, they even looked at legends like Orson Welles and Peter Sellers. Sellers wanted so much money that they had to pass. Falk himself rejected some suggestions. He vetoed Danny Kaye without ever explaining why. When Columbo was first being developed in 1971, NBC executives were skeptical. Actually, they were worried. Television had rules back then. The hero had to show up right away, or people might change the channel. But the creators of Columbo, Richard Levinson and William Link, didn't care about rules. They made the audience wait nearly 30 minutes before Columbo even showed up. That kind of delay had never been done before, and executives called it the longest stage wait in television history. They thought viewers would get bored and leave. But what happened next turned the entire detective genre on its head. Instead of a typical whodunit, the show told you right away who the killer was. That was the twist. You watched the murder happen. You saw how carefully the plan was put together. And then you sat back to see how this quiet, awkward detective would slowly tear that plan apart. People thought knowing the killer would kill the suspense, but it didn't. It made things more intense. It became a game of how he would catch them, not if he would. And Columbo didn't use guns or car chases. He used polite questions, everyday logic, and an eye for tiny details, like a smudge on a wine glass or a thermostat set too low. But there was something else underneath it all that made Columbo so powerful. It was about class. Columbo wasn't rich. He drove a beat-up car, wore the same wrinkled coat every day, smoked cheap cigars, and talked about his wife constantly. And the people he went after, they were surgeons, actors, CEOs, generals, people who thought they were too important to get caught. Columbo never treated them like they were special. In fact, he often made them uncomfortable. He'd ask what their expensive painting cost, or mention that his wife had something similar at home, just to see how they'd react. The show quietly exposed how the rich assumed they were untouchable, and Columbo made sure they weren't. At one point, NBC tried to interfere. After only a few episodes, they pushed the creators to change the format. They wanted Columbo to appear earlier, and they wanted more traditional storytelling. But the team refused. Levinson, Link, the producer William Finnerman, and even Peter Falk himself all stood their ground. They said they would quit before changing the show's heart. It was a huge gamble, but it worked. Viewers loved it. Ratings climbed, and the executives backed off. From the moment it premiered on September 15, 1971, Columbo was something different. It aired as part of NBC's mystery movie rotation, sharing space with other detective shows, but it quickly became the favorite. And Peter Falk's performance was a big reason why. That season, he won an Emmy. Over the years, he won 4 more for the role, along with a Golden Globe. His messy charm and careful delivery made Columbo unforgettable. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He just asked one more thing, and suddenly everything would fall apart for the killer. NBC's rotating format gave the show longer episodes, sometimes 90 minutes, so the writers had more time to build tension and character. That breathing room made Columbo feel more like a movie than a TV show. And it worked so well that NBC moved the lineup to Sunday nights, where it dominated the ratings. Columbo was now not just a hit, but a prime-time anchor. What no one expected was just how far the show would reach. It didn't stay in the United States. It went global. Syndicated in 44 countries, it found fans everywhere. In Hungary, fans built a statue of Columbo. In Romania, people were so upset when the show ended that Peter Falk had to record a message to explain that it wasn't censored, it had just ended. Decades later, the BBC still called it timeless. It turned out that Columbo's quiet persistence, his sense of justice, and the satisfaction of seeing arrogant criminals brought down, those things mattered to people everywhere. And the guest stars? Columbo turned catching murderers into an honor. Big-name actors lined up to play the killer. Jack Cassidy did it 3 times. William Shatner did it twice. Patrick McGoohan won Emmys for his appearances. Leonard Nimoy, Robert Culp, George Hamilton, even Martin Landau played twin killers in one episode. It was a stage for talent. Even behind the scenes, the show attracted greatness. A 24-year-old Steven Spielberg directed the first regular episode. Peter Falk knew immediately, this guy is too good for Columbo. In the summer of 1973, something strange happened in Hollywood. Brian De Palma, a rising director with a strong dislike for television, decided to write an episode for Columbo. This was the same De Palma who had just released Sisters, a dark thriller that proved his love for Hitchcock-style storytelling. But Columbo had impressed him so much, he teamed up with his friend Jay Cox, a respected film critic, and sent in a script out of nowhere. They even used a fake name for Jay, borrowing Joseph P. Gillis from Sunset Boulevard, like they were in on a private joke. What made it even more surprising was that this all happened during a writer's strike, when the show was desperate for content. De Palma, who normally looked down on TV, crossed into a world he didn't like, because he saw something different in this scruffy detective show. The story they came up with was wild. A filmmaker named Quentin Lee, clearly modeled on real-life figures like Truman Capote, murders a talk show host and films the whole thing. But this wasn't just a murder, it was a statement. Lee wanted to prove that a crime without motive could be the perfect one. So he throws a dart at a list of celebrities in his building and picks someone he finds cheap and fake. He calls them a public zircon, a fake diamond, not worth much in his eyes. His twisted plan gets even darker when he decides to make a documentary about it and includes Columbo himself in the footage, without the detective knowing. It gets meta fast. There are even 3 students following Columbo with cameras, one of them named Spielberg, a wink to the real Spielberg who had already directed an early episode of the show. But the timing wasn't in De Palma's favor. The strike had left the show behind schedule, and producers were scrambling. Another script called Double Exposure by Stephen J. Cannell was also submitted during the strike. It was faster to shoot and had a villain who used subliminal images to commit murder. A cool idea, but easier to manage on a tight schedule. De Palma's script was more complicated, full of visual tricks and layered storytelling. The producers liked it, maybe even more than some of the episodes they ended up making, but they just didn't have the time or resources. Some bits from De Palma's work were borrowed later, like the film student idea, which showed up in the episode Mind Over Mayhem. That version even had a character named Steven Spielberg, spelled slightly differently, but clearly a nod to what De Palma had written. The real problem was tone. Columbo usually featured killers with clear, selfish motives: money, revenge, power. De Palma's villain didn't care about any of that. He wanted to make a point, to commit murder as an artistic experiment. It reminded people of Hitchcock's Rope, where the killers thought they were smarter than everyone else. But that wasn't what Columbo was about. The producers probably felt the audience wouldn't connect with such a cold, strange character. De Palma's usual themes, watching people through cameras, blurring the line between truth and performance, were powerful. But they didn't fit the cozy Sunday evening feel of the show. Some people even imagined John Lithgow in the lead role, but they worried he was too tall and intimidating for TV at the time. In the end, the episode was shelved. Buried under production stress and creative differences, Columbo had a formula, and it worked. The killer is shown in the beginning. The mystery is never about who did it, but how Columbo will catch them. Slow, clever, and polite, he always sniffed out the truth. But then came No Time to Die in 1992, and everything changed. There was no murder at the start, no calm investigation. Just panic, screaming, chloroform, and a disturbing kidnapping during a honeymoon. It felt more like a horror film than a Columbo episode. Instead of quiet deduction, Columbo teamed up with a police unit, held a gun, and raced against time. The final moments ended in gunfire. Nothing like the Columbo fans had known. Some called it bold. Most called it the worst episode ever. But it wasn't the only time the show took a strange turn. When Columbo returned in 1989 after 11 years, it did so with Murder, Smoke, and Shadows, a Hollywood-themed episode that pushed theatricality to absurd levels. The villain was a flashy young film director who acted more like a Spielberg parody than a real threat. A single scene of Columbo wobbling on a waterbed went on for over 10 minutes. And the big reveal, police officers dressed in costumes popped out dramatically, with spotlights and music like it was a stage show. It felt more like a joke than a mystery. Still, compared to what followed in the revival years, some fans later defended it. That same year came Murder, a Self-Portrait, and things got even stranger. Instead of piecing together clues, Columbo solved the case by interpreting surreal dream sequences recorded by the victim. There were visions of meat in a sink, pocket watches in teacups, and even a French uncle that somehow meant monocle. The killer was a narcissistic artist, living with both his current and former wives, until one of them died. The story leaned heavily on symbolism and psychology, but it barely made sense. Columbo suddenly knew more than a trained therapist, and the supposed repressed memories turned out to be fake. Still, the portrait he received in the end left a lasting impression, even if the plot didn't. Fast forward to 2003, and Columbo was investigating raves. Yes, raves. Columbo Likes the Nightlife was the final episode ever made, and it tried to drag the rumpled detective into the 21st century. Loud music, neon lights, and a crowd of sweaty dancers replaced the usual quiet living rooms and cigar smoke. Columbo wore a feather boa, wandered through nightclubs, and even retrieved a toenail clipping from a toilet by hand. The plot involved a cover-up, a murder, and a tabloid journalist. But most people remember the episode for how surreal it felt. It was jarring, awkward, but oddly fascinating. Some viewers loved the effort to modernize him, others just missed the old days. Not all missteps were bizarre on purpose. Back in 1972, Peter Falk got his shot at directing with Blueprint for Murder. It was a tough shoot. He was frustrated with the producers, who handed him an episode set at a real construction site just to make it harder. Falk called Spielberg and Cassavetes for help, and even paid extras out of his own pocket when the studio refused. The result was uneven. There was no murder shown on screen, and pacing was all over the place. Fast at first, then dragging. Even the music choices felt odd, with the same Brahms concerto popping up again and again. Falk's acting suffered too. Juggling both roles wasn't easy, and he never directed another episode again. When Peter Falk played Columbo in 2003's Columbo Likes the Nightlife, most fans assumed that was the end of the road. But behind the scenes, that wasn't the plan. In 2007, Universal Studios quietly began work on one last episode, what would have been the 70th and final case. The working title was Hear No Evil, but it was soon renamed Columbo's Last Case to make it clear. This wasn't just another mystery. This was going to be a farewell. Falk was almost 80 by then, and he didn't want to just fade away. He wanted to leave the stage with dignity, one last time in the rumpled coat that made him a household name. A full 102-page script was written, carefully built to let him close the book on Columbo the right way. The timing was perfect. It was the 40th anniversary of the character's first appearance back in 1968. The story was as clever as ever. It centered around a high-tech murder using sound. Something modern, but still grounded in the kind of psychological twists the show was famous for. A tiny clicking sound was the first clue, something only Columbo would notice, and it slowly unraveled the killer's plan. To make things even more special, the script included a scene with Larry King playing himself. It was supposed to be a fun cameo, just like the old days when stars like Johnny Cash or Janet Leigh showed up unexpectedly. From the opening scene to nearly the very end, the episode played like classic Columbo. Smart, slow-burning, and full of little moments that built towards something big. But even with a full script and Falk ready to go, the project ran into a wall. ABC, which had aired Columbo movies for years, didn't want it. The reason? Falk's age. Network execs made it clear they weren't interested in a TV movie with an 80-year-old lead. Charles Engel, one of the decision-makers, bluntly said, "No one wants to buy a movie with an 80-year-old lead." It didn't matter that Falk had already played Columbo into his 70s and still held an audience, or that Columbo's whole charm was how people underestimated him. The networks wouldn't budge. Universal tried reaching out to overseas investors, hoping the global popularity of the detective would be enough. But without a big United States network backing it, the momentum stalled. Then came the hardest blow. In 2007, Falk's health started to decline. After some dental surgeries, people close to him began to notice changes. His memory started slipping. Not long after, it was confirmed. Falk was showing signs of Alzheimer's. In 2008, the diagnosis became public, and by then, the damage was clear. The man who had once played a detective sharper than anyone else on television could no longer even remember being Columbo. His daughter would later testify in court that he no longer recognized familiar faces, including hers. By 2009, it was obvious there would be no final episode. The farewell that had been planned with so much care would never be filmed. In 2011, Peter Falk passed away at 83. He died from complications related to pneumonia and Alzheimer's, taking Columbo with him. Peter Falk may have looked like a tired, wrinkled detective in a rumpled coat, but behind that lazy stare was a man who took his work more seriously than anyone around him. Falk didn't just play Columbo, he was Columbo. He brought his own clothes to set, insisted on getting every single detail right, and refused to be rushed, no matter what it cost the studio. A simple 10-day shoot could stretch into 2 full weeks, just because Falk stopped mid-scene to rework a line or dig into a character's motivation. If someone tried to push him, they'd usually regret it. Even studio executives knew better than to argue. That famous raincoat? It wasn't from wardrobe, it was his. That mumbling, meandering style, carefully calculated. Falk kept actors guessing so their reactions stayed real, and it worked. Columbo felt like a man you knew, even if you couldn't figure out what made him tick. But not everyone got along with Falk. When the producers were casting the episode Negative Reaction, Danny Kaye's name came up. He was a major star, and most people would have jumped at the chance. But Falk, flat out, refused. No one really knows why, but it's the only time he ever blocked someone from appearing on the show. Some think it was because they'd worked together before in comedy, and Falk didn't want Columbo to turn into a joke. Others believe it was just a clash of styles. Either way, Falk wouldn't budge. It was his show, and if he felt someone didn't fit, they were out. Simple as that. While Falk was battling for control on set, the writers were dealing with a different kind of nightmare. Columbo's format, showing the murder at the start, was totally different from other crime shows. That twist meant writers had to work backward, building tension without relying on a surprise ending. Most found it exhausting. In fact, when NBC invited 60 professional writers to watch a pilot, only 2 were interested in writing for the show. That's how tough it was. So the writer's room became a pressure cooker. They spent entire days locked in brainstorming sessions, sometimes grabbing anyone who walked by just to help fix a stuck storyline. One guy, Larry Cohen, just popped in to say hi and left with a writing job because he solved a story problem no one else could crack. And when NBC decided to extend the episodes to 2 hours, things got worse. Scripts were padded with pointless scenes just to fill time, and many felt the quality started to slip. Then, something crazy happened. Decades after it ended, Columbo blew up again, this time with a new generation. Between 2020 and 2023, the show saw a 300% spike in streaming. People stuck at home during the pandemic found comfort in Columbo's slow, thoughtful pace. And the younger crowd loved the show's anti-rich vibe, since nearly all the killers were upper-class snobs who thought they were untouchable. Columbo, with his scuffed shoes and soft voice, kept bringing them down to earth. Social media helped too. TikTok, Twitter, even fan mods of Among Us started popping up, all showing love to the scruffy detective who always got his man. And then came the memes. Suddenly, there were Columbo edits everywhere. A Twitter account imagined him as a 3-inch-tall cop solving tiny mysteries. A parody video had him investigating Tumblr posts, and fans became obsessed with his weird little quirks. The never-seen wife, the ancient Peugeot, that unforgettable line, "Just one more thing." He was now part of internet culture, more popular than ever, but without changing a thing. He was still the same humble genius, catching killers with kindness and confusion. Peter Falk never let go of that role. He won 5 Emmys for it and kept pushing to make the character better, even after decades. To this day, people across generations still debate whether Columbo was just lucky or secretly brilliant. Maybe both. That was the beauty of it. You could never quite tell if he was fumbling or faking, and by the time you figured it out, he already had you.